Buddy Bryan Alvarez here, After Dark Radio. We are here every Tuesday. 2 Pacific, 5 Eastern Sports Byline Broadcasting Network, as well as video.f4wonline.com, which is our YouTube channel, video.f4wonline.com. Here to talk all of the news of the weird, and we were scheduled to have a special guest here today, but in fact, that guest was unavailable. And so your special guest here on the program today is myself. And we got a lot to talk about here today because a couple of weeks ago, talked about it here on the program, I headed to the Chehalis Flying Saucer Party, and there were a bunch of speakers. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about what everybody said about UFOs. It was actually the Contactee edition of the Flying Saucer Party. So we'll talk a little bit about contactees here. And there were a couple of very interesting things that, in fact, I learned from some of these speakers. And I also had the opportunity to watch a very special movie in the theater. So we'll tell you about that here today. We've also got to talk about the rapture. The rapture, well, it didn't happen. It was supposed to happen yesterday. I think it was supposed to be a 2-day rapture. Kind of like a 2-day WrestleMania. It was supposed to be yesterday and then today. But alas, it did not happen. We have to wait for the next rapture. So we'll tell you about some of the wild things that happened related to that. And also today I'm going to talk about a book that I just finished reading. I was in Cannon Beach and I read Pacific Northwest Legends and Lore by Ira Kittmacher. And, of course, I'm here in the Pacific Northwest. I'm here in Seattle. And a very fun book. So we'll tell you about some of the stories in that book. And if you're in the Northwest area, well, maybe you'll want to check it out. So a lot to get into here today on the program. We're going to kick it off after the break. After Dark Radio, Sports Byline Broadcasting Network. Alvarez here, After Dark Radio, every Wednesday, 2 Pacific, 5 Eastern, Sports Byline Broadcasting Network, as well as twitch.tv/F4W video, video.f4wonline.com. You can always watch the show live in either of those places. And, of course, you can subscribe. We've got a lot of podcasts up for those on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or WrestlingObserver.com. All 3 of those subscriptions get you After Dark Radio. That's F4WOnline.com/Spotify, F4WOnline.com/Apple, and F4WOnline.com. And I was reading the chat during the break, and somebody made a point I hadn't thought about. I wasn't going to start with a rapture, but that seems to be what people are talking about here. And this person made a good point. He says, the rapture happened, just none of us were taken. Well, that sucks. So if you haven't heard about it, I guess there is a South African preacher, a pastor, Joshua Mlakela, who predicted the rapture was going to take place yesterday. He said it would occur on September 23rd. He said, the rapture is upon us. Whether you are ready or you are not ready, the rapture is 14 days from now, he said. This was 2 weeks ago. No human being on this earth is ready for what is coming. I began to hear literally in my ear the sound of the trumpet. The rapture, of course, is when Jesus returns to take those who are going to heaven, and the rest of us will remain here, and that will not be good. The pastor on his podcast to 426,000 subscribers said that he was, quote, 1,000,000,000% sure, 1,000,000,000% that the rapture would take place on Tuesday. He said that Jesus appeared to him in a dream in 2018, saying on the 23rd and 24th of September 2025, I will come to take my church. So, there have been stories about the rapture coming since the 1800s. And actually, I'm sure, obviously long before then, there were stories that at some point, Jesus would return. But the term rapture, I think, dates from about the 1800s. And, it's been every 10 years, there's, this is going to be the day. This is going to be the day. When I was a kid, I remember my mom telling me when she was a kid, she would hear, such and such a day, 1967, it's over. The rapture is here. And, of course, the rapture never comes. We had 2012. Everybody knew by the end of the world, 2012. There was obviously Y2K. It wasn't the rapture, but, a lot of people were convinced the world was going to end in one way or the other when Y2K hit. And, there was 2020 was a rapture year, and now 2024, and it has come and gone. And it kind of seems silly, except when you really investigate, like, what happened with this most recent one here. And granted, maybe these people were pretending, but there were people that they quit their jobs. There were people that sold all of their stuff. There were people that were psychologically damaged, crying, weeping, very worried about what was going to happen to their animals, who's going to take care of their animals when they get raptured and the animals aren't raptured with them. So, there were a lot of people that were messed up by this whole thing. And now it's come and gone, and I guess they got to get their cars and their jobs and got a lot of extra pet food they can get rid of. But there was no rapture, so that is that. I am a little bit confused as to what the point of selling the cars in advance was, because you're selling the car, like, you can't take the car with you to heaven apparently, but you can't take the money either. So what's the point? You may as well just keep the car, and if the rapture doesn't come, you got a car. But now they got to get a car back. At least they got cash for it. Except for those that gave away their cars. Probably, perhaps regretting that today. But anyway, yes, the rapture did not come. Now we have to wait for the next one, which is probably sometime in 2030. All right, so we got a couple of other things here. Moving on, since the world did not end. Somebody here was asking about this latest interstellar object that is entering our solar system. And We're going to talk about that a little bit here today. But mostly what I want to talk about is this Chehalis flying saucer party. I plugged this a couple of weeks ago, and I went, and I had a pretty good time, as I always do. This is the second year in a row I've gone, and there were several speakers, and some were better than others. I was not thrilled with the speaker lineup, to be honest, and it wasn't because of the speakers themselves, but I'm interested in the idea of the UFO phenomenon. I don't necessarily believe that aliens are visiting Earth. In fact, if we're being honest, I'm quite skeptical of that. I do believe there is life elsewhere in the universe, although we still haven't proven that to be true. I mean, as far as we know scientifically, the only life in the entire universe is on Earth. I find that very hard to believe. I do think there is life elsewhere. I would bet that within the next few years, they confirm that there was, at one point, life on Mars. In fact, we read an article a couple of weeks ago about how there was new evidence from Mars that there probably was life on Mars billions of years ago. Maybe not so much today, but I do think within the next few years, once it's confirmed that life once existed on Mars, I mean, I think at that point we pretty much know that there's life everywhere in the universe, because, I mean, there's so many different, we discovered so many planetary systems around stars very much like our own. You know, there's planets everywhere, I'm sure, that have water, that are in the habitable zone. And even you know, we talk about the habitable zone, habitable, the zone where things can live. But, you know, when we talk about that zone, and this is one of the things I need to get like an astrophysicist or something on here, astronomer. It always seems like when we talk about, well, where could life, you know, what are the requirements for life? What we're looking for is requirements for our life. We don't know anything about life elsewhere in the universe. I mean, we presume that a planet must be a particular distance from its sun, so it's not too warm and it's not too cold, because we presume that if it's too warm or too cold, nothing can live because of how life is on this planet. But as we examine things on this planet, I mean, they find life in like some really inhospitable places here on this planet. So I would presume that if life is spread throughout the universe, it probably can survive in all sorts of different, I mean, super hot, super cold. I would expect that we don't need a habitable zone for life to exist elsewhere in the universe. But for now, that's where we're looking, because we have our lives to look at. But anyway, the point of this is, I do think there's life elsewhere, but I am skeptical that life is necessarily visiting our planet. Maybe it is. I do believe that there's something very weird about the UFO phenomenon. I mean, obviously, I think that a lot of people are seeing a lot of weird things. I think much of it is probably man-made, and much of it might be something else, but not necessarily aliens from another planet. So anyway, I was, you know, I'm not really into contactees, but there was some interesting stuff, particularly from Vince, I think it's Enzunza. He was the second speaker, and he was talking about whether you believe in contactees or not. It is a fascinating topic, and he had some very fascinating things we're going to talk about when we come back after the break. He was the best speaker of anybody. He had a lot of good stuff. He was very charismatic, and I learned a lot. So we'll talk about his UFO speech after the break. After Dark Radio, Sports Byline Broadcasting Network. I got the show, Bryan Alvarez, here After Dark Radio every Wednesday, 2 Pacific, 5 Eastern. Sports Byline Broadcasting Network, as well as TuneIn Radio. You can listen to Sports Byline on TuneIn Radio. F4WOnline.com/YouTube and Twitch.tv/F4W Video. We're talking UFOs and contactees. What is a contactee? Well, a contactee is not just somebody who saw a UFO, but someone who met the folks on board the UFOs and talked to them, had conversations, maybe was visited many times by the same individuals, and sometimes allegedly was even taken for a ride in the flying saucers. And at the Chehalis Flying Saucer Party, the first speaker of the day was Chris Grant, and he's a podcaster, and his talk was From Science to Sacrilege, Analyzing the Enigma of UFOs and Abductions, and it was basically kind of just a primer. If you know nothing about it, he kind of talked a little bit about the history of it. It was all right. The problem was he was very monotone, and it was very early in the morning when I got there, and I almost fell asleep. He did a fine job, but it's funny because when he finished with his actual presentation, and then he just spoke like a human and take some questions, like he was way more charismatic. So anyway, the second guy was Vince Enzunza, and his talk was Lewis County First Contact. And I had no idea what this was about going in. And essentially, the contactee gimmick, so to speak, was a big thing in the 50s and 60s. The 50s and 60s, I think, were the heydays of the contactees. These were people, in 1947, there was the Kenneth Arnold sighting, which is why there is a Chehalis Flying Saucer Party, as I've talked about before. And then, there was Roswell, although really, Roswell didn't become a thing until the 80s. It kind of just came and went, and nobody in ufology really talked about it much for decades afterwards. So it was really Kenneth Arnold saw the flying saucers, then that became national news. He became a celebrity. Everybody started seeing UFOs. They were in the newspapers, all of these movies from the 50s, there were all these, UFO and alien movies from the 50s, and it just kind of exploded from there all the way up through today. But the contactees were kind of an offshoot of just the whole UFO phenomenon. Everybody was reporting seeing UFOs, and then soon you had these people that said, the aliens visited me, and they took me for a ride here. We went to Venus. We went to the moon. They would have photographs that they had taken, the whole shebang. So the contactee thing was like a pretty big deal in the 50s and 60s. And what most people would say was the first famous contactee was a guy named George Adamski, or Adamski, however you feel at any particular moment in time. George Adamski was the first famous contactee. Wikipedia says he was widely known in ufology circles and to some degree in pop culture after he displayed numerous photographs in the 40s and 50s that he said were of alien spacecraft. He claimed to have met with friendly Nordic alien or space brothers and claimed to have taken flights with them to the moon and other planets. He was the first, it says here. This is actually important. Wikipedia says Adamski was the first and most famous of several so-called UFO contactees who came to prominence during the 50s. Most UFO researchers and investigators regard him as a charlatan and a con artist and concluded that many of his claims were an elaborate hoax. He wrote some very famous books. Flying Saucers Have Landed. That was the first one in 1953. Inside the Spaceships in 1955. And Flying Saucers Farewell in 1961. The three books sold a combined 200,000 copies. And there's a lot of information here. I mean, he had all of these photos, and, he told a lot of stories. And, a lot of the photos, the most famous one is actually almost a meme. It's a photograph of allegedly the bottom of a flying saucer. Like, look up, you can see the bottom. There's like these three, semicircular protrusions, and it's your classic UFO. It looks like a safari hat. But anyway, it is believed to be a chicken brooder that he used a surgical lamp and a chicken brooder to create this photograph here. That's what people believe. But anyway, so I go to this Vince Inzunza, and he's telling the story of George Adamski, and it's interesting enough. But then he gets to why the presentation is called Lewis County First Contact. So everyone talks about Roswell, which happened in July of 1947. But in fact, the flying saucer craze, it actually started a month earlier with Kenneth Arnold. It actually, even before that, there was an incident, the Maury Island incident, it is called. Up here in Washington State, there's a place called Maury Island. This guy claimed that he looked up and he saw these UFOs, and one exploded and stuff fell out of it into the water, and then the government allegedly came to investigate, and this whole thing. And there was a pilot. Actually, he wasn't a pilot, but he was a pilot. He wasn't like, he had a number of other things that he did, but he was like a pilot on the side. And he was flying from, I guess, Boise, Idaho. And, he was told there's a downed military airplane near Mount Rainier. If you happen to see it, there's a reward. And so he diverted and went to look for it. And that's when, over Mount Rainier, he saw all of these objects flying in a formation at allegedly this incredible speed. And, he radioed in that they looked like saucers skipping across the water. That's how they moved, like saucers skipping across the water. So some newspaper writer wrote a story about it, and they heard they moved like saucers skipping across the water. And so they wrote that he had seen flying saucers. And in fact, what he had seen weren't saucer-shaped. They were more kind of boomerang-shaped. But anyway, flying saucers became a thing. And what's interesting is that even though what he saw was more, actually a crescent moon would be closer to what he saw. They were like crescent moons. That was the shape they were in. But this newspaper article erroneously wrote that they were saucers. They were round. Well, lo and behold, all of these people across the country, they don't start seeing crescents, they start seeing saucers. So anyway, all of these flying saucer stories come out and everything like that. And anyway, the Chehalis Flying Saucer Party celebrates the fact that they argue we kicked off this UFO thing. Roswell gets all the credit nowadays, but in fact, Washington State came before Roswell by several months, in fact. And so I guess, at some point, they're actually going to do like a friendly debate. The people from the Chehalis Flying Saucer Party and the people in Roswell are going to kind of debate who came first. But anyway, that's why they do this every year, because they want people to know we were first, not Roswell. Roswell's made all this money off being the birth of the UFO mythology, but it wasn't them, it was us. So on that topic, the reason that his presentation was called Lewis County First Contact is because George Adamski here gets credit for being the first contactee, but in fact, there was a guy named Samuel Eaton Thompson, an older guy, and he lived in Lewis County. He was right outside Chehalis, and he claimed that he had been visited by Venusians, people from the planet Venus. And he made this claim in 1950. So, in fact, the actual first known contactee in the history of ufology is not George Adamski, but it's this guy, Samuel Eaton Thompson, from Lewis County, Washington, very close to Chehalis. And it's not just a story, because very few people know about this guy. But in fact, after Kenneth Arnold had his UFO sighting, he kind of became a celebrity. And so he ended up like going all over the country and interviewing all of these people who claimed to have seen UFOs. And he interviewed Samuel Eaton Thompson about his experience with these Venusians. And not only that, but Vincent Zunza said that for the first time ever, he had audio of this interview that Kenneth Arnold did with Samuel Thompson. And he played it during his presentation. And, I mean, there wasn't really, like, a lot to learn from it. It was just astounding because for everybody that's heard the story of Kenneth Arnold, I mean, I don't think anyone's ever heard him, like, do anything like this. But he did an interview. He interviewed this guy about his story, and he asked him what happened, and where did you go, and what did they tell you, and... You know, he was kind of tongue-in-cheek about it a little bit, but, you know, this Samuel Eaton Thompson, he had a whole story, and we'll tell you about it after the break. After Dark Radio, Sports Byline, Broadcasting Network. Joe Bryan Alvarez here, After Dark Radio, Sports Byline Broadcasting Network, twitch.tv/F4W video, F4WOnline.com/YouTube. We're talking contactees. So, this Vincent Zunza played this tape of Kenneth Arnold interviewing Samuel Eaton Thompson about Samuel's incident. So, Samuel claimed his story is that he was driving through Centralia, and he saw a craft in the woods. And so he pulled over, and there were a bunch of naked, tan children playing outside the craft. And then the craft door opened, and naked, tan adults came out. And they invited him into the ship, and he said there were about 20, 25 of them. And he went into the ship and stayed there for 2 days as they told him all sorts of things. Everything about Venus, everything about how humanity was all screwed up. His claim was that everyone, this is all astrological related, everybody living on Venus was born under the sign of Venus, the astrological sign, and coincidentally, he was as well. And so everybody born outside of that, well, they were just trouble. And that was, I guess, 11/12 of humanity. So, interestingly enough, coincidentally, they also talked about the rapture. They said that the rapture was coming in 10,000 AD. So we got a ways to go. Don't sell your car. But he was on there for 2 days and came out, went home, and ended up telling this story to Kenneth Arnold. This story got no traction for like 30 years. So it was like 1980 that Kenneth Arnold took this tape that he'd recorded, and he gave it, I think, to Fate magazine. But, I mean, other than that, like, there was one small article, like 11 paragraphs in the local newspaper, and that was it. It did not get any traction. And I bring that up because, and I stated earlier, I don't know if I don't believe aliens are visiting Earth. I'm quite skeptical. I can't rule anything out because I don't know, but I'm skeptical. I've seen no good evidence, if we'll put it that way. But I've seen a lot of evidence that something weird's going on. And Kenneth Arnold interviewed this guy, and how can I say this? Kenneth Arnold didn't believe his story was true, okay? He didn't believe that this guy was visited by naked, tan Venusians who told him that everybody not born under the sign of Venus or whatever. He didn't believe any of that. However, he basically said, you know, this guy is like, I don't know the term to use, but like such an uneducated, simple, like he did not believe that this guy was capable of making up this story or blatantly lying about it. So what he basically believed was this guy had some sort of psychic experience or some sort of something where it didn't really happen the way that he explained it, but this guy believed it really happened. That's what Kenneth Arnold believed. And what's interesting about it is the story that he told is very similar to stories that have been told in the past that this guy almost certainly would have had no knowledge of whatsoever. There was a very famous UFO flap in the late 1800s, the airship flap. This was before the Wright brothers. There were these sightings of these airships, kind of like blimps, dirigibles, but they were like airships. And there were, this is late 1800s, reports of them flying. They were sighted all over the country. And you know, it was like taken seriously enough that Thomas Edison had to publicly state, I did not invent these airships, because like everybody was seeing them and everybody just figured, well, it's some sort of new technology and probably Edison is behind it, some sort of airship. And these airships would land every now and then, and people would report talking to the people that had that were piloting the airships, and they would tell these weird stories about, they weren't like we came from Venus, but they would be weird stories like, I was in Seattle yesterday, I'm going to be in Chicago tomorrow. Like just these distances, it just didn't make sense. But it was very bizarre, and a lot of people told these stories. And a lot of the stories that these people told about the airship operators were very similar to the story that Samuel Thompson said about the folks from Venus. And then, like I said, this was an extremely obscure story in 1950. One article in one newspaper in Lewis County. There's almost no chance that George Adamski or any of these other contactees had ever heard anything about this guy or his story. It's not like today where there's the internet. There's virtually no chance that they knew about this story. But like a lot of the contactee stories sound exactly the same. Your space brothers and sisters. They're from Venus. They're here to help humanity. Like all of this stuff. The stories that he told that ended up coming out in like 1980 when the tape ended up coming out, and Kenneth Arnold talked about it. All of these other stories were remarkably similar to the story that Samuel Thompson told. So, number one, he was the first contactee. It's pretty much acknowledged now that he was the first. But it's also just fascinating how similar his story was to other stories that he probably would have heard nothing about, and how other stories of the contactees were so similar to the story that he told, and they would have known nothing about him. So, I do believe that there's something weird that is responsible for a lot of these different things, but I don't know what it is. I'm very skeptical of the idea of aliens visiting Earth or, people coming from other dimensions, that sort of thing. But I think there is something where people are seeing very, very similar things, whether it's a psychic experience or, whatever, I don't know. But I just feel like there's something there, and that's why I'm so fascinated with all of this, because there are too many tie-ins to other things for it to be people just making up stories. Another good example, I'm reading a book about Bigfoot, and it's actually a historical look, and this guy has gone through all of these old newspapers, and the term Bigfoot wasn't even a thing until the 60s. And, there were, in the 50s, people in the Himalayas, climbers reported seeing these weird tracks, and, there were talk of these Yetis. And then in the 60s, there were the Bigfoot tracks, and then the Patterson-Gimlin film, and then Bigfoot exploded. So a lot of people think, well, it all started in the 60s. But you can go back and, there's evidence of Native Americans seeing Bigfoot-like creatures dating back hundreds of years. And anyway, this guy had these articles from the 1800s of these wild men. And wild men seen in British Columbia, wild men seen in Washington State. And, there was no Bigfoot mythology or anything. It's just people said, I was in the woods and there was this giant guy and covered in hair, long hair, big footprints. And these are very, very obscure articles in just random newspapers in the Pacific Northwest from 1800. So, I don't know if, I don't know. Bigfoot exists, does it not? But what I do know is that people have been reporting Bigfoot-type creatures for hundreds of years. And what they are, I don't know. But clearly, people are seeing something. You could always argue, well, they're probably seeing bears, but I mean, the people that reported these things, particularly in the 1800s, I mean, these were outdoorsmen. They knew bears. They had seen bears. They'd probably come in contact with mini bears, and they reported this thing that to them was not a bear at all. It was a hairy wild man. So anyway, it also brings me to another question from the chat here. Somebody asked, when was the first crop circle? And it's the exact same thing with crop circles. The crop circle phenomenon, I think, dates back to like the 70s. And, there's still crop circles today. And the thing about crop circles is there were two guys that were responsible for making many crop circles. And because of the way things go, now a lot of people believe that they made every single crop circle, which of course is preposterous. There were crop circles seen all over the world for ages. Before and after these guys were around making crop circles. Sure, they made some of them. Did they make all of them? No. Well, what is it? I don't know. Is it, a lot of people would say crop circles, aliens landed and they left the thing in the... I don't know if that's the case. But what I do know is that whatever phenomenon is creating crop circles, that's another one where we talk about it in modern terms as a crop circle, but you can go back hundreds and hundreds of years, and it's the same deal where, people would have stories about fairies. And what did the fairies do? They danced in a circle, and they would leave this essentially crop circle. They weren't called crop circles back then. But, I mean, those same designs in the grass, the corn, the crops, whatever, they've been around for hundreds of years, probably thousands of years, and they've always had a different name. So what exactly all of this is, I don't know. I'm fascinated by it, but I don't know what it is. So he had a very, very good speech, Vince Inzunza, very good presentation, and it was by far the best thing at the Chehalis Flying Saucer Party. So then, there were a couple of others as well, and the speaker Q&A was it was pretty good. And then, yes, the main event, Plan 9 from Outer Space, the famous Ed Wood film, largely regarded as the worst film ever made. It's not, but for a long time, in the 80s actually, they had a list and it was at the top, but I'm sure there have been many worse movies made since. But it's a terrible movie. But it's one of those movies, and in fact is so bad it's good. And I've never seen Plan 9 from Outer Space. It's a famous movie. I've seen Ed Wood, but not the original Plan 9. And so, man, I drove down at 7:15 a.m. so I could get the VIP package because I wanted to make sure I got to get into the theater to watch Plan 9. I did not want this thing to sell out. I had to be in the theater for it. And 7 o'clock rolled around, and it was me and two other old people. The only ones in the entire theater. But I sat through and I watched that entire movie on the big screen. And now I can say I did. And it was freaking horrible. Back in a moment. After Dark Radio. Sports Byline Broadcasting Network. Here, After Dark Radio, Sports Byline Broadcasting Network, twitch.tv/F4W Video, TuneIn Radio, Sports Byline. And, man, we didn't get a chance to talk about this book, Pacific Northwest Legends and Lore, where I learned about the Bandage Man of Cannon Beach, Oregon. That's right. The bloody bandage man who leaps out at cars. Don't tell my children about this guy. But yeah, there were a lot of great legends and lore. They even talked about the famous Maltby Cemetery, which is about 15 minutes from my house, that I once investigated, although I found nothing. But it's a fun book. We'll talk about that one of these days. In fact, no guest next week, so maybe next week we'll do Pacific Northwest Legends and Lore. Man, there's Bigfoot, there's sea monsters, there's hauntings, there's Thunderbirds, werewolves and dogman around this area, believe it or not. The Bellingham Curse, Cape Disappointment, all these places I've been. I didn't even know how haunted they were. We always go to the Maritime Museum in Astoria, and apparently Astoria is very haunted. I know there's at least one haunted theater, but allegedly there's hauntings all over the place because so many people die trying to cross the bar, which apparently is the, I guess, the most dangerous bar in the entire world. Getting into the Astoria area. Anyway, a lot to talk about, but we got to wrap it up for today. I want to thank everybody for listening. You can always send your emails. Any stories, fun tales you got, Bryan at AfterDarkRadioShow.com. Send it to me so I can read them in the future. And that's it, everybody. We'll talk to you next time. After Dark Radio, Sports Byline Broadcasting Network.